Yo, yo, yo. Hey, yo, what's good to all my heroes and villains out there? You know who it is. It's your boy, LC. And guys, welcome to another episode of Heroes and Villains Collectibles. And, yeah. My drink's all the way over here. Hope everybody's chilling. Hope everybody's having an awesome weekend. It's, Saturday, man. So, Saturday night. So, hope everybody's having a good one. Salute to everybody out there. You guys already seen the title. We're gonna be chilling, just talking. We're gonna be checking out the story for the what is it? The Daredevil, because we got the Disney Plus series coming right on time. We're about to be hitting up right now some of the Comics Explained, the Daredevil Born Again storyline, which is the story that Marvel's gonna be telling when it comes to the new Daredevil Disney Plus show coming out. So let's get into it, man. Smash that like button, yo. Smash that like button, peoples. Let's do it. Whether you guys are watching now or watching later.
We have never covered Daredevil Born Again, and I'm kind of surprised by it. So, this opens up with Karen Page. And most of you guys know Karen Page as basically the secretary, or at least at one point, the secretary of Daredevil. In this particular instance, Karen Page had basically quit her job with Daredevil, and she followed the wide-eyed girl's dream of going to Hollywood and making it big. And 4 times she did, but then her career fell off. So she went down to Mexico, started making adult films, eventually became a drug addict, and her life is in an incredibly bad place at the moment. And so, because of the fact that she's so desperate, she sells the identity of Daredevil as Matt Murdock to just some low-level guy for a drug hit. And like, that's it. That's all it is. It's not for huge amounts of money or anything like that. Now, eventually, this information works its way up the chain, as you would expect, and eventually gets to the Kingpin Wilson Fisk. Now, that's one of the big misconceptions about Kingpin in Marvel Comics, that he only ever operates in New York. 9 times out of 10, yes, he's in New York City doing criminal stuff, but Kingpin's worldwide. He has informants all over the place, so it makes sense, especially down in Mexico, that it would work its way up there. And this is information that Kingpin cannot pass up. And so what he does is, over the course of about 6 months, which is kind of a time skip here, he goes to work on Matt Murdock. The first thing he does is he uses contacts at the IRS to basically initiate an ongoing audit on Matt Murdock, which is to say, the IRS starts an audit and there's no end in sight, but it gives them the authority to freeze his assets. So he has no money aside from whatever he happens to have in his wallet. At the exact same time that happens, his girlfriend Glory breaks up with him. Beyond that, he ends up getting served a subpoena to appear before a grand jury for the fact that he is basically taunting witnesses. And this is testimony coming directly from a police officer whose record is spotless. So like, right off the bat, things are falling apart. Now, the IRS is the biggest part. Because of the fact that his assets are frozen, he can't pay any of his bills. That means that his apartment gets foreclosed on, all that kind of stuff, right? He loses everything. And so following that, you do momentarily switch over to Ben Urich. Now, he's not a significant part of this particular story right now. He does become important later on in the story. In fact, he's arguably one of the most important people in the story as you get through it. What this does, though, is it switches to Daredevil going to visit Nicholas Manolis, who's the police officer that's supposedly testifying against him. And Daredevil doesn't really like try to pummel the guy or anything like that. It's just kind of like, wow, man, 20 years, you've had a spotless record, and then suddenly you're lying about Matt Murdock? Like, what in the world's going on? But he doesn't really get any answers. Instead, Daredevil just gets chased out of the apartment by Nick, who just starts brandishing like a broken beer bottle at him, right? And so, of course, Nick ends up calling up, the Kingpin and saying, hey, Daredevil came to visit me. You guys may want to check this out. Yes, like, I'm still working with you guys. Now, the cool thing about this is that Nick is not some corrupt cop. I mean, he's acting like one, and I guess technically now he is, but he's actually got a tragic story, because what you find out here is that Nick's son is in the hospital with a heart condition, and because of the amount of money that it takes in order to get to work on this kid with surgery and whatnot, he can't afford it between his healthcare plan and cash on hand. So he ended up being approached by the Kingpin, who offered to help him in order for him to testify falsely against Daredevil. So it's just a father doing whatever it is that he needs to do for his son. And that's the the reason why Daredevil doesn't overhear this conversation and then jump back into the apartment and just start beating Nick within an inch of his life, right? Because he just feels bad for the guy. Now, the other part of this is Foggy Nelson. But again, Foggy Nelson's role here is more supportive than anything else, just kind of an ongoing member of Daredevil's life. But what's kind of nuts is that Wilson Fisk gets these updates over a period of time, right? It says, for the next few weeks, things go poorly for Matt Murdock. He writhes like a fly in a spider's web. My web, thinks the Kingpin, so carefully woven, so neatly placed. His plant at the law library reports to the crime lord of Murdoch's days spent working with his partner Foggy Nelson beyond all fatigue, striving to form a defense against the perfect frame. Photographs taken by telescope for the man's defenses are yet unknown. Provide a stop-motion study of Murdoch's deterioration. Most delicious are the nights as low-level stoolies like distant nerve endings tell of increasingly violent, increasingly aberrant assaults by a warrior whose fists are no help against the corrosive gas that fills his life. Assaults which climax in an enlightening episode. It happens in a waterfront saloon, one he frequents to pry information from the lowest echelon of my organization, one he enters now as an angry beggar with no sense of caution or strategy. And it's just like Daredevil going through this bar, trashing everything, assaulting everyone, asking if anybody knows about Matt Murdock. And that's one of the things that you're going to realize here over the course of this story. Matt Murdock goes more and more insane. It's not just enough to strip him of his ability to function in life, but it's to also break him on a mental and emotional level, with Daredevil being unable to find any clue, hide nor hair, of who's behind all of this. He's fighting shadows. And so what we're told here is no one tells him anything of value, no one could, but one. For I have kept my movements scattered among a dozen lieutenants, none of whom possess more than a single scrap of information. I have given the word from Stilson to Karen Page, all who might know will die. Daredevil is Matthew Murdock and more. There is a rift inside him, a wedge steadily weakening his reason, steadily driving him insane. Through it all, I am told Murdock is a ghost, a shell of a man, because that's the other part of this. Anybody who knows the identity of Matt Murdock, a kill hit has been ordered by the Kingpin. He wants to be the only one who knows the secret identity of Matt Murdock. More so than that, those who do know Matt Murdock's secret identity are basically people he can go to, people he can talk to. But if all those folks are out of the picture, if they're dead and gone, if someone like Karen Page is gone, there's no one there to offer safety to Matt Murdock, and there's no one there to reveal that Kingpin is the one that's behind all of this. And so what we're told here is, even as he hears the much-tempered verdict of the court that he will not face a prison sentence as I'd planned, that he will lose his license to practice law, whatever reactions he has are hidden, even, I suspect, from himself. He faces poverty and public shame. He will be hounded by doctored tax files, deprived of his very home. Survival will become his only concern. Perhaps I will hire him, what's left of him, after a time, after he has learned how powerless he is. His talents would be valuable, and his manner will crush itself. And so it's cool because it really is just breaking this guy down. More so than that, it shows how meticulous the Kingpin can be. Because when Kingpin comes after you, it won't be just you. It'll be you and anyone you ever met. Woe betide the poor soul that Kingpin sets his sights on, because there's no limit to how far he will go to take you out. Now, for Karen Page herself, her journey actually starts leading her to the United States, but it's not without its own trials and torments and whatnot, because as soon as she gets back to her apartment, or at least where she's supposed to be, there's a guy who's like looking to kill her, right? A person sent there by Kingpin. So most of her story is her just fleeing from down in Mexico and trying to find a way to New York, which she ends up doing, albeit basically hitching a ride with a pretty shady guy, as you would expect from somebody in her circumstance. For Matt Murdock, this is where things go from bad to worse, because with like $10 in his pocket and 30 days until he's foreclosed on by the bank and no money to pay the debts that he owes, he makes his way back to his apartment only for it to be blown to pieces. It literally gets blown up by the Kingpin. So now he has nowhere to go. He's got no home, he's got no money, no nothing. But here's a crazy thing. You would expect him to turn to someone like Foggy Nelson, but it doesn't, right? He uses the last $10 in his pocket to basically get a room at a pretty seedy hotel that has no real heating of any kind, and he's basically just freezing in this place, right? He's got the window closed, but it's not really doing a whole lot against the cold outside there in the world. And he just kind of starts to descend down into this madness. He's
Yo, how many of you guys are ready to see Ben Affleck back as Daredevil in Secret Wars? Daredevil back as Daredevil back as Ben Affleck. Ben Affleck back as Daredevil in Secret Wars with Charlie Cox is Daredevil. You know what I mean? Oh man. But yeah, the word on the block is yeah, it's happening.
convinced that it's Kingpin, but he doesn't know that it's Kingpin.
Which makes sense because we already had Elektra, you know what I mean, in Deadpool and Wolverine. So why would we not have Daredevil?
And that's one of the big differences between how you see Daredevil in this story and how you traditionally see Daredevil in Marvel Comics. He'll say he knows a thing, but it's usually done by way of like intimidation, right? Getting a person to believe that he's holding all the cards, and this person, seemingly having no way out, spills the beans. In this instance, it's the ravings of a madman, right? He's just screaming at the ether about the fact that Kingpin's behind him and all that kind of stuff. Then he starts to convince himself that Foggy Nelson is a part of all of this. And so with Kingpin realizing that Matt Murdock's mental state is just deteriorating day by day, he knows it's only a matter of time before he does something too extreme, and that will ultimately land him in jail. The cool thing about this is things don't work out the way that Kingpin expects them to, but it doesn't happen the way you think it does. It's amazing the way that, dude, the way this story ends is phenomenal. So what is going on here is that Matt Murdock calls up Foggy Nelson, and he's just kind of like screaming and raving about things, right? You know, I don't need to be in your all's lives and all that kind of.
He said, you got knocked the fuck out.
Stuff and, you know, so on and so forth, and just kind of hangs up on everybody, but he's showing like very, very manic habits, things that just look like a guy who's having a psychotic break. Then he calls back up and he tells Foggy, he's like, I'm on to you, Nelson, and then hangs up the phone. And it's just kind of nuts, right? The things that he's doing. More so than that, like the actual apartment manager or hotel manager, whatever you want to call him, shows up there to collect money from Matt Murdock. Matt just like beats the crap out of the guy and then leaves, right? And so what you end up getting here is this almost kind of play-by-play, which is something that Kingpin gets routinely on the goings-on of Matt Murdock. And you basically learn that he's just like sitting on a train, and there's these guys who show up on the train and they start brandishing firearms and threatening everybody, right? Saying, you know, we're going to rob you. And he doesn't do anything. He just sits there until one of the guys points a gun at him. And then he just starts fighting like a man possessed and almost kills them, right? In fact, I think he actually does kill one of them. It's crazy, right? I mean, he just beats these guys bloody. And then there's a cop who shows up that has no clue what's going on. He just sees a dude on a train attacking everybody. He tells Matt Murdock to freeze, and Matt beats the crap out of a cop. And that's when Kingpin's like, this guy's broken, right? Like he's done, like dunzo, that's it. But not only is Matt Murdock assaulting cops, Kingpin knows he's doing it because he's growing increasingly paranoid, because Matt Murdock, following this, calls up Foggy Nelson, right, and just kind of tells him about what's going on. And what he says here is like, I'm losing my mind, I'm having a psychotic break, like I attacked a cop and I was convinced the cop was working for the Kingpin. I don't know what's going on, but like I need to go confront the Kingpin, right? It's the best chance I have. Only for him to walk away from the phone and for us to find out he was never talking to Foggy Nelson. He was just talking into the phone like a maniac, right? This is how this guy is broken. I told you guys, right? This story gets so good. Like, it's so incredible. But like, Kingpin breaks him apart. It's incredible. And so finally, Matt Murdock makes this move where he goes to confront the Kingpin, and he just like shows up in the Kingpin's gym. And Kingpin knew this was going to happen. He knew that Matt Murdock
And then I hear about to fight him butt naked.
was going to come and find him at some point. But given how hard life has been for him, he's not going to be much of a challenge at all. And so Kingpin finally gets what he's always wanted, which is the chance to break Daredevil. And that's what happens, man. This fight is brutal. I mean, it is intense. And Kingpin crushes this.
If I'm not mistaken, in the either season 2 maybe, or season 3, Like they did, if I'm not mistaken, they did do or season one. They could, but I don't really remember. But I think they did do a version of Karen Page like being an alcoholic. You know what I mean? I think they did that in the Netflix show. Could be wrong, but I think I seen that. You know?
Sky in no uncertain terms. And while Daredevil's just laying on the ground like, I'm never gonna give up, right? I'm gonna fight you until my dying breath. Kingpin's like, well then allow me to oblige, and just delivers this final blow. After that, they take the body of Matt Murdock, they throw it into a taxi cab.
And then in the show, the only time, what is it? Kingpin beats the shit out of Daredevil is in like the visitors thing scene. You know what I mean? So Matt Murdock shows up, Daredevil shows up as a lawyer, and then they start having a conversation. Kingpin is locked up, and then next thing you know, Kingpin just gets up and starts beating the shit out of Daredevil.
And they drive it off into the East.
Who's Matt Murdock, the lawyer?
River, believing that Matt Murdock is dead. This dude digs himself out of a car and just goes lumbering through the alleyways of New York City. And so at that point, just in Hell's Kitchen, he ends up stumbling across the gym that his dad worked out in. And what he does is, as he's there, he just ultimately kind of passes out. And then he's saved by a nun, which admittedly is kind of his mom here, right? It's one of the things that Frank Miller was toying with. And so for a good portion of this story, Daredevil is actually rehabilitated by his mother, right? They nurse him back to health, and then he starts going to work. So what we're going to do for a good little bit of this is we're going to sidetrack from Daredevil for a second and talk about what's going on with the other characters, because all these roles start to come together and converge at the end of this story. And I want to kick things off here with Ben Urich, because one of the things that happens is that Ben Urich, knowing Matt Murdock as he does, knows that Matt Murdock wouldn't just like taunt a witness arbitrarily, as it was explained by that officer Nicholas Manolis in that court testimony. And so what ends up happening is that Ben Urich goes to visit Nick and starts talking to him about his kid. Now, of course, Ben Urich is an incredibly accomplished reporter to the point that he's actually a pretty accomplished detective. And so his investigations lead him to finding Nick in the hospital with his son. And he just kind of starts talking to him, right? He's like, how's your kid doing? And like Nick offers a little bit of his guard down and kind of implying the fact that yes, his testimony was false, that yes, he was kind of paid to do it, but he doesn't really offer a whole lot. Instead, the two of them go outside following the death of his son, which happened shortly after midnight. And that's when Nick's just like, even after everything I did, my son couldn't be saved. And so he effectively agrees to become a confidential informant for Ben Urich as a source and dump all the information. And that's when you find out the nurse that had been working alongside Nick this entire time is actually a henchman for the Kingpin. She shows up and she pummels Nick, and then she breaks every finger on one of Ben Urich's hands. And she tells them, if you were a publisher, my employer would destroy your presses. Since you're merely a typist and it would not be persuasive to destroy your typewriter, my employer has asked me to make it plain to you that every time you speak the name Matthew Murdock, you shall lose the use of your fingers. And so she breaks all 5 fingers on one hand, and then she pummels Nick within an inch of his life and makes Ben Urich watch the entire time. Now, as far as Karen Page goes, because she's trying to flee from these assassins of the Kingpin, she ends up just like making her way through this kind of side alley in Mexico. And because she's fixing for a hit so bad, she ends up robbing a beggar, right? And like when this guy tries to stop her, she just like cracks him over the head with a vase and seemingly kills the guy, grabs his money, and then bails. Now, this ultimately leads her coming into contact with a pretty shady guy who agrees to like bring her to the United States, but it's pretty bad, right? He's just kind of like, look, I need some company on my trip up there, if you understand what I'm saying, right? I do for you, you do for me. It's pretty bad, but ultimately she agrees to do it because at this point in her life, she's pretty much at rock bottom. There's very little that she's not willing to sacrifice in order to get to where she needs to go. Here's a crazy thing. With this guy that she's with, these assassins show up. You know what this dude does? This dude unloads with both barrels of that shotgun, blows these guys to pieces, and it's just like, you better be worth it, snatches her up, and then heads to New York City. The cool thing about all of this is that Wilson Fisk is working out, exercising, but there is a thought in his head that he cannot get rid of. There was
working out that gut. He got that gut.
There's no corpse in the taxi cab. Matt Murdock isn't dead. And for the first time in a long time, Wilson Fisk starts to feel a tinge of fear. The other thing about this is that for Ben Urich himself, right, witnessing what happened to Nick, while Nick's not dead, it really breaks him almost on a personal level, where he's like, I don't really want to be involved with this anymore. It's one of these instances where he almost abandons the story. And so switching over to Karen, she ends up getting a hold of Foggy Nelson and actually kind of takes off to go meet him, but not without being assaulted by what's basically her drug supplier now, is really who this guy is, and tells her like, come back or like I will find you and then I'll kill you. And so switching back to Ben for a second, while he's there at the Daily Bugle, he meets with J. Jonah Jameson, and Jameson tells him like, what you're doing here is not the first time that I've ever seen this happen. It's one of the coolest moments with Jameson here. And he's like, I have seen so many instances where a reporter comes up on a fantastic story that involves some kind of criminal in some capacity, and then suddenly they lose all interest, right? You may not want to tell me what's going on, but I know that you've been intimidated. But here's the thing. In this line of work, we are the most powerful people on the face of the planet. 5 million readers worth of power. We can depose mayors. We can destroy presidents. And it's been due to get aimed at the kingpin for years now, but it needs you to do it. Stop taking the coward's way out. As a reporter, you are going to put your life on the line, and you're going to put the people that you care about in jeopardy. That just comes with the nature of it. So either be a reporter or be somewhere else, right? It's really cool, but it's not Jameson like laying into Ben Urich. It's Jameson being real with him and telling him what it really means to be a reporter. But what ends up happening is that while Ben Urich ultimately stands down from the story itself, while he's at his desk getting basically yelled at by his superiors, he gets a phone call from Nurse Lois, the woman that accosted him and Nick. And because of the fact that Nick had called up Ben and said, I'm ready to testify and tell you everything that you want to know about how Kingpin is involved, Lois is in his room. She literally takes the phone away from Nick, she puts the receiver down on the bed, and she makes Ben Urich listen to Nick dying as she chokes him to death. The idea here is that it was going to put Ben off the story. It was going to intimidate him so badly that he just couldn't do it. The opposite happens, and it actually inspires him to work even harder on the story than he was before. And so what ends up happening is you switch over to Karen meeting with Foggy, and as the two of them kind of start talking, Karen doesn't really spill the beans on the fact that she's the reason all of this is happening in the first place. She talks a little bit about how hard her life has been and the fact that she's just made a series of poor decisions that took her from bad to worse. But when she reveals that the guy she's with is beating on her, then Foggy's just like, you're not going back there, right? And where she's just like, oh my God, no, he's gonna kill us. Foggy's like, I mean, he's hardly the first guy to make a threat like that, right? Like, if he really wanted to kill you, you'd be dead by now, right? And so he ends up grabbing her and they go back to his apartment. And so after his recovery, a lot of what Daredevil does, Matt Murdock does, is just kind of going back and getting his body back to a solid physical state at Fogwell's gym, right? Where his dad used to work out at all the time. So it's slowly kind of rebuilding his strength. But there is this really amazing moment with Kingpin. So what happens here is Kingpin's in a meeting with all of his lieutenants, and that while they're talking, they've all kind of been talking amongst themselves about this vendetta that Kingpin has with Matt Murdock, and that doing things like blowing up his apartment and stuff like that, while it does send a message, it's a little too on the nose, right? And despite the general public's illusion that Kingpin is a legitimate businessman, the reality is that everybody in the criminal underworld and most of the superheroes out there know that he is a tried and true gangster. So he's basically signing his name for those who were intelligent enough to see it. And so one of these guys stands up and is like, look, here's the thing about this personal vendetta, right? Like, we're just asking you to explain why you hate and are going after Murdock so much. And so what happens is Kingpin doesn't answer him. Instead, he just says, Mr. Switzer, this is a check for your current market value for your shares in the conglomerate. Take it or your family dies. You were all dismissed. He literally just gets rid of him on the spot. And then his assistant basically says, Mr. Switzer has a weekend in Colorado planned. He loves to ski. The response of Wilson Fisk, compound fracture, both legs. Has this guy's legs broken like that. It's dope, dude. I love the way Kingpin is done in Frank Miller's run. He's so incredible over the course of this story. And so what ends up happening is you kind of switch back over to Ben Urich again. Don't worry, guys. Not going to leave you hanging on Matt Murdock, right? We're going to wrap back around. It gets dope. What you do is you switch over to Ben Urich. And Ben Urich's just kind of talking to like the cops and everybody around him, at least the cop that was brought in. Like, hey, here was the deal. Nick was going to testify and he was going to say that Wilson Fisk Kingpin basically told him, we will help help you save your son. I'll give you the money you need for the surgery, and you will testify falsely. You'll perjure yourself, basically, against Matt Murdock. And so what he ends up doing is taking this story and putting it out there in a 6-part series in the newspaper by the Daily Bugle. So now word is out, right? It's really more rumor than anything else. People don't really know how much of this is true. But now word's out there on the street that Wilson Fisk Kingpin is not a legitimate businessman. This guy is actually a criminal that is basically engaging in a bunch of criminal activities, both blue collar and white collar. And so Lois herself is actually dismissed by her employer, but instead she decides to go directly after Ben Urich herself. And so what happens is that when Matt Murdock meets with Ben, they end up heading back to Ben's apartment only to find out that like Lois is there. So a fight breaks out between Lois and Matt while Ben Urich goes to find his wife, who was basically hung, right? Like literally just there. I mean, she's not dead, right? She's like gurgling and that kind of thing. So ultimately he cuts her down. But for Lois herself, I mean, they really kind of beat each other right to the point where they're basically unconscious. Matt's not dead, but of course this leads to Ben Urich calling the cops. The cops show up and the cops basically arrest her. The other part of this is that Stilson, the guy that normally works on the Daredevil suits for Matt Murdock, ends up calling Ben and saying, hey, look, man, like Kingpin and them are going to kill me unless I make this Daredevil costume. And of course, Matt Murdock, overhearing all of this, leaves Ben Urich. He goes to visit Stilson and he says, make the costume, right? Whatever it is that they have planned, go along with it, right? Like, I'm not some guy who's incapacitated anymore. I want to see how far down the rabbit hole this goes. The reason why this Daredevil costume is being made comes by way of Kingpin basically going to an asylum for the criminally insane and finding a psychopath who they're going to dress up as Daredevil and then send him in to kill Foggy Nelson. And so what it's going to look like is not only has Matt Murdock basically been discredited, but now he can't even operate as Daredevil because Daredevil is going to be going on a murderous rage. And this is why I say all these pieces start coming together again, because when you have Karen Page at the apartment of Foggy Nelson, that Karen looks out the window and she sees her supplier down there. The guy's just waiting on her. Foggy Nelson calls the cop. This cop shows up and this drug supplier lets loose again with both barrels of this shotgun on this cop and even his partner, right? Takes them both out. But the whole area, that whole building with Foggy Nelson in it, Karen Page, and even this dude who's just out there doing his own thing is being observed by the Kingpin's henchmen. And he tells them, if anybody comes out of that building, kill them, blow their heads off on the spot, be done with it, right? Like that's it. And so this kind of crazy psychopath guy in a Daredevil costume shows up to the building for Matt Murdock to jump in right at the exact moment and attack this guy. And he just like beats the crap out of him, right? Like beats this dude unconscious. The fight's pretty intense. And in fact, it even makes its way up to a rooftop. While that's going on, you've got Karen Page fleeing for her life alongside her drug supplier who's firing back at these guys who were basically sent by the Kingpin trying to kill the two of them. Of course, her drug supplier is killed and then Karen Page robs this guy, right? Like literally just like steals the drug fix off of this guy while she's being shot at the whole time. But then Matt Murdock arrives on the scene, takes these two guys out, saves Karen Page, and then Karen Page finally spills the beans on everything. She tells him, like, I'm the reason why you lost it all. I sold your identity to just some dude down in Mexico for a drug hit. He passed it up to the Kingpin, and that's why the Kingpin has been destroying your life. So now, Matt Murdock has a target. Instead of him just falsely believing or just erratically believing it's the Kingpin, now he knows it's the Kingpin. Here's where things go crazy. With Wilson Fisk becoming more and more desperate to destroy Matt Murdock, he calls in Frank Simpson, also known as Nuke. Now, this is Nuke's first appearance in Marvel Comics with this story. But Nuke, man, this guy is crazy, right? When this dude shows up, man, this guy does not engage in stealth. This dude just shows up, guns blazing, right? That's just the nature of his character, right? He's absolutely bonkers. But before we get to that, we switch over to Ben Urich, who goes to visit Lois in jail, because now that she's basically been captured by the cops, as an agent of the Kingpin, she's like, I'll spill the beans. I'll tell you whatever it is that you want to know. Kingpin gets wind of this. So what he does is he sends in one of his own as a quote-unquote bodyguard for Ben Urich. He does this by basically finding some pretty shady photos about the police commissioner and then blackmails the police commissioner into having this done. It's kind of cool, right? So like once Lois starts to talk, this guy immediately pulls out a gun, blows her head off on the spot in front of God and all. Now, of course, Ben Urich goes to try to like stop this guy and take him out. And because he's so enraged, he ends up just grabbing this revolver off to the side and using the butt of this revolver beats this dude to death. But it's crazy because like everybody in here is dead. The cop, the legitimate cop who was a guard is dead. Lois is dead. There's another dude who's dead. It's just like been in here, right? I mean, it's kind of crazy. And so what you get is Kingpin, who meets with Nuke. And what he does is he kind of feeds him all this false information, right? You know, like there's madness that's surrounding this place, right? The infection of the American spirit, you know, and Daredevil, Matt Murdock is the man that you need to be targeting because he is this corrupt anti-patriot feeding off the underbelly, the soft underbelly of our nation, that kind of thing. And so it basically leads to like Frank Simpson going after this guy. Now, Nuke does have a handler. And one of the things to know is the only reason Kingpin was able to even get his hands on Nuke is because he has contacts in the US military. So he was able to bribe a general in order to bring Frank Simpson back to the States to operate on behalf of the Kingpin. Because you don't normally do that. You just send that dude into a village in Nicaragua somewhere and he just massacres everybody and like that's it. And that's what happens here. That because of the fact that Matt Murdock is basically working at a diner momentarily to support both himself and Karen Page, who he's helping to wean off of her drug addiction, Frank Simpson shows up in a helicopter and an M16 rifle with a rocket launcher on top and just starts shooting the place up, man. This dude just lets loose. It's crazy. He's firing rockets off left and right. I mean, it's nuts. Like, the stuff you see is bonkers here. There's like a helicopter that arrives on the scene, seemingly from cops, and just like Frank Simpson shoots it down with a gun, just like blows the thing to pieces. It crashes on a rooftop. And so Matt Murdock puts the Daredevil costume back on again. But here's the funny thing about this. This all actually took longer than he expected it to. That what he expected here was for Kingpin not to send somebody in this quickly, before it to take weeks to come to a head like this. Shadow games, different things like that. This tells Matt Murdock that Kingpin is getting sloppy and he's getting desperate. And so this fight between Matt and Nuke is nuts. I mean, it's basically just a ton of shooting. There is some hand-to-hand combat here, but Daredevil realizes pretty readily that Frank Simpson is more than he can handle in his current state. It really just comes down to him being more acrobatic as opposed to relying on brute strength, doing what he can, where he can, when he can. But it is pretty solid because as this fight unfolds, of course, as you would expect, Daredevil gets the upper hand on him. The problem is that because this fight is so extreme, it leads to the arrival of the Avengers. And Sal over at Comic Pop loves talking about this moment in Marvel, and I don't blame him for it, because when the Avengers arrive on the scene, you've literally got Daredevil just choking out Frank Simpson. He's getting ready to kill him. And Iron Man is just like, that man's ours on federal authority. Hand him over, right? You're not an Avenger, man. You're a street level guy. Let us deal with the bigger things here. And so Captain America and the Avengers take Nuke and they walk away. It's nuts. It's kind of crazy. Now here's a cool thing, and here's what's interesting here. Captain America comes back to visit Matt Murdock, and it's like, what's going on with this guy Frank Simpson? Like, what's the deal with Nuke? And even Daredevil's like, I have no idea who this guy is. So Captain America goes to visit a general, right? And he's like, what's going on with this Frank Simpson guy? And the general won't give him any straight answers. So Captain America ends up going to what's basically a top secret sub-level within this building and starts looking up files. And what you learn, and this is something that's been expanded on over the years in Marvel Comics, is that because of the success of Captain America and Project Rebirth, that while it's not explicitly stated here because it hadn't been created in Marvel Comics yet, that the organization Weapons Plus, which was responsible for creating Captain America, tried to create other super soldiers. Frank Simpson is one of those, as is Wolverine and Deadpool and all those different guys. And so it's him just kind of learning that like Project Rebirth lives on, right? And so ultimately, of course, switching over to Frank Simpson here for a second, things go sideways because this guy is so amped through a combination of his drugs, his schizophrenia, his cybernetic enhancements and whatnot. He flips his mind while he's in detainment, breaks his handcuffs, and kills everybody except for the colonel or the general, the guy who controls him, takes one of his pills, which he literally has this like in his arm, right? Like pops this pill out, takes this thing, gets himself amped up, and then in turn goes back out there to try to find Daredevil again, right? Hunting this guy down. Now, of course, Captain America shows up here before Frank Simpson could get too far and absolutely pummels this guy. This, of course, leads to Daredevil finding out that like Frank Simpson's still there, things are going sideways. Captain America tries to take Frank Simpson to a rooftop. He gets sprayed down or almost gets sprayed down by like the colonel in the helicopter, right? Just, you know, that minigun that's stationed on that thing. But Daredevil saves them both. And so following that, Captain America deals with the soldiers while Daredevil realizes that because Frank Simpson had been contracted by the Kingpin, he's the ace in the hole. So what he does is he grabs Frank Simpson, throws him in a cab, and beelines directly to like Ben Urich. The problem here is that once he gets to the Daily Bugle, Frank Simpson succumbs to his wounds, right? Having been shot in the chest. So Frank Simpson basically dies. There's no information to be had here. Here's the benefit. Captain America had stumbled across one of the flunkies of Kingpin, but a guy who had just enough information to be able to spill the beans on what's going on, which is exactly what he does. He spills the beans on everything. And so what you end up getting are all these lawsuits that come out of nowhere. And while it's not the Kingpin who is completely and totally destroyed, thrown in prison for the rest of his life, it does destroy his reputation. But remember, this is the opening story for Frank Miller's Daredevil run. So what you get is basically Kingpin waging a one-man war on Matt Murdock, which is more intense than he ever had before. This leads to the introduction of Elektra, Bullseye, the death of Elektra. It's amazing. With that being said, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like. If you want to see the rest, let me know down in the comments, and I will catch you all later. Peace.
Alright guys, on that one, this was dope, this was awesome. This has been another episode of Heroes and Villains Collectibles Story Time. I'm your boy, LC. Until next time, guys.